Good morning.
Good morning. Wow.
I'm Cyril Draffin, and we have the sign-up sheet for wrestler's class. So if you're not on here, add your name. If you are on here, put a little check mark.
Is this the sign-up sheet for the refreshments? If you would like to volunteer for that, I'd appreciate it.
We know you would, but just as you're just waiting. So today is part of a two-part series on Abraham Lincoln and the Second Inaugural Address, which is judged to be Lincoln's greatest address, judged by Lincoln. Yes, no. So first of all, if you want a copy of the inaugural address, you can have one.
No, I have one. Thank you.
So the plan today is to listen to the tape, because I told some of the people we're going to hear the reading of the Second Inaugural Address. Then we'll have discussion. Then we'll hear Ron White's commentary on it and have some discussion, some more commentary and have some discussion. And then we'll follow up on it next week. But I thought I'd start with a couple questions. So how many of you heard Ron White talk about American Ulysses on Thursday night? Okay. And how many of you heard Ron White when he was here in wrestler's class in 2002? Okay. And this is Lincoln's Greatest Speech, the Ron White book, signed by Ron White in this room in 2002. So there's an historical history with wrestler's class and Ron White, who is a very articulate guy. And I assume no one else has read this speech. There's only one got one eager reader here. That's good. Today I'm a facilitator. I'm not the lecturer. Ron White's the lecturer, and you're the thinkers. So this is an engaged process. So what I thought I might do is, rather than directly opening in prayer, I thought we would listen to a couple of words from Abraham Lincoln. And we'll consider this our word in prayer. The Almighty has his own purposes. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous together. Let us judge not, that we be not judged. So what we'll do is I'll start the video, and
should I get the mic, please?
Paul said he would do it.
Okay.
This second appearing to take the oath of the presidential office, there is less occasion for an extended address than there was at the first. Then, a statement somewhat in detail of the course to be pursued seemed fitting and proper. Now, at the expiration of 4 years, during which public declarations have been constantly called forth on every point and phase of the great contest, which still absorbs the attention and engrosses the energies of the nation, little that is new could be presented. The progress of our arms, upon which all else chiefly depends, is as well known to the public as to myself. And it is, I trust, reasonably satisfactory and encouraging to all. With high hope for the future, no prediction in regard to it is ventured. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it. All sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive. And the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union, even by war. While the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with, or even before the conflict itself should cease. Each looked for an easier triumph, and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us not judge, that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered, and that of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to the man by whom the offense cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war might speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with a sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. It is my pleasure to introduce best-selling author and Lincoln biographer
The Second Inaugural Address. I thought I'd pause and get your reactions to that. This is from a man who had 1 year of education. And also, Ron White's comment is, when leadership and integrity seems in short supply, Lincoln has emerged again into our national consciousness. So I'd be interested in your initial reactions to the speech and how it might be relevant today.
I didn't realize that Lincoln was so versed with the Bible, but yet I haven't heard that he was part of any church or religious group. Is there any history on that?
There is, based on what Ron White said, that he had not gone to a church, but that if you hear the words, he clearly had a lot of religious connotations. But let me pause and see other people's comments on that. Come to that point.
I worked at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, which Lincoln attended. They still have his original pew, even though the rest have been remodeled. And he actually met weekly. The name of the pastor is starting to be escaping me. But he met weekly with him in the chapel, and they had a prayer session and a time together. His young son, I think it was Tad, who died, left all of his earthly belongings to New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. Although he may not have been a member of the church, certainly throughout, from the beginning to the end of his terms as president, he was a very active member in a mostly private way. So clearly his faith ran very, very deep. He was very important.
Any other comments on that particular
I'm a member of the First Presbyterian Church in Springfield, and he rented a pew there and was present every week he could be. And I think that generally it's accepted among Christians that he became a Christian during that period with Tad's death in 1861. Though this is still debated among the specialists.
I was just going to say that his use of vocabulary was profound, and the structure of his speech. So you have to listen very intently to follow it because of the sentence structure. It's wonderful.
My reaction to this was that the grandchild of this speech was the Marshall Plan and the treatment of Japan in 1945, 6, and 7.
And Ron White made a comment that at 9/11, they didn't know exactly what to say or do, and so they read the speech. So it's relevant.
Slavery figures very prominently in this speech, but I think most historians say that freeing the slaves was a byproduct of the war. It was not the goal of the war. It was certainly the goal of some of the Northern abolitionists, but that Lincoln did not have freeing the slaves initially in mind as the goal of the war. You've had that interpretation.
You can listen to the comment.
But that he was okay, he would have been okay with slavery continuing in the South if the South had stopped fighting. That he was opposed to, of course, to expanding it into the new Western territories.
As I understand it, the goal of the war was to preserve the Union. Slavery was the great, the big gorilla in the entire debate. And of course the South didn't want to discuss their peculiar institution, as they sometimes called it. But the goal of the war was to preserve the Union.
That view of Lincoln's changed as the war progressed. He was willing to countenance the slavery in the South in the beginning. But as the war progressed and as he saw the blacks fighting for their freedom, his views changed considerably by the end of 4 years.
Now, my historical understanding has always been that the slaves were freed with the Emancipation Proclamation, largely to keep the British out of the war. That once he did that, the British, who had abolished slavery 25 years earlier, could no longer enter the war on the southern side.
Okay, so what we'll do now is listen to the commentary, the start of the commentary, and I'll probably stop 2 or 3 times and then talk about the issues that were just raised in that commentary.
Ronald C. White Jr. and Lincoln's greatest speech.
How many of you have been to the Lincoln Memorial? Depending upon where you live or go to school, I suspect quite a few of you have, and others I hope will be able to do so in the future. Would you come with me to the Lincoln Memorial? If you do, the Park Service visitors will tell us it's the second most visited place in Washington, second only to the Vietnam Memorial. As you walk up the steps, what you will see first is the tall Daniel Chester French statue of Lincoln, 29 feet high. As you walk inside what I call that temple space, if you turn to the left, carved on one panel is the Gettysburg Address. If you turn to the right, carved on 3 panels in Indiana limestone, is the Second Inaugural Address. Today we're going to take an adventure of understanding. I want to help us understand Abraham Lincoln, and through Lincoln's words, help us understand the Civil War. You remember that Lincoln was born in 1809 in Kentucky, moved with his family in 1816 to Indiana, and then as a 21-year-old moved to Illinois in 1830. He separated from his family and lived in the tiny village of New Salem. He was elected to the Illinois State Legislature, served 1 term in Congress, and then in 1860 was elected the first Republican to be President of the United States. Did you know that Lincoln had only 1 year of formal education? And yet he has become what many of us would want to say is our greatest president What I would like to say today is he's our most eloquent president. Lots of people look at the Lincoln Memorial at the Gettysburg Address. It is a wonderful address. But did you know that Lincoln really thought his second inaugural was what he called his best effort, his greatest speech? So together we're going to try to discover in these 700 words something of Abraham Lincoln, and from Lincoln something about the meaning of the Civil War. Now, I'm an historian, and I know that I want to place this, if I can, in the history of the 19th century, but the remarkable thing about Lincoln is his words reach across time. At the first commemoration of 9/11 in New York City, in the year 2002, people looked for a poet or a politician to give voice to their deepest feelings. At the end of the day, they simply said together Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. We've got to remember the context in which this was offered. A nation had been at war for 4 years, 620,000 dead, as many as all of our other wars put together. Lincoln is inaugurated for a second time. Lincoln that day will face a crowd that comes in the midst of mud and rain, 35,000 of them. A reporter for the Times of London, sometimes people outside of one's own culture see things quite clearly, was struck by a group of people that he suspected had never been to an inauguration before. Almost half the crowd were African Americans. You've seen inaugurations on television. You know what wonderful celebrations they can be, especially that you're a candidate. I expected that this inauguration would be a time of great celebration, but in reading some of the letters and diaries of people who were there that day, I discovered, to my surprise, quite a different feeling. Many of the people were deeply angry, as they wrote in their letters. Angry, why? Because think about it. Probably every person in the crowd had lost a father, husband, son, brother in this terrible, tragic Civil War, and they wanted Lincoln to give voice to their feelings of anger. That's what we do in times of war. We demonize the enemy. Surely he would give voice to their deepest feelings. Lincoln had spoken 25 to 30 minutes in his first inaugural, but this inaugural address would only be 701 words. Let's try to understand through Lincoln's words something of who he is in American history. Lincoln begins at this second appearing to take the oath of the presidential office. There is less occasion for an extended address than there was at the first. This is not exactly 407 years ago. What is Lincoln doing in this first sentence or in this first paragraph? It's not entirely clear. May I make a suggestion? Lincoln does something in the first paragraph that in a sense breaks all the rules of modern studies of leadership. Modern leadership is often suggesting, hyping, if you will, all the great things the leader is going to do. Lincoln is going to take exactly the opposite tack. He is going to want to diminish the expectations of his audience. Look carefully. Line 2, he says there is less occasion for an extended address. Line 8, little that is new could be presented. The second to the last line of the first paragraph, no prediction in regard to it is ventured. It's in the second paragraph that we begin to get a sense as to what Lincoln is doing. And I suggest that Lincoln is asking a question that almost no one in the early months of 1865 is asking. He's asking the question, how can the South be brought back into the Union after this Civil War is ended? And his answer begins by his use of what I call inclusive language. Let's see it together. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending Civil War. All dreaded it. All sought to avert it. The word all is inclusive. Do you sense what Lincoln's doing? He is, at the outset of this address, imputing the best possible motives to the people of the South. He is not demeaning them. At the end of the paragraph, both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war. Aha, you may want to say, as has been said to me, but at the end of that paragraph, Dr. White, isn't it true that he says both parties deprecated war, inclusive language, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish? Aha. When you and I listen to teachers or politicians or preachers, we need to pay attention to what that person does not say as well as what they do say. Just think if Lincoln would have said it this way: both parties deprecated war, but those Confederates, those rebels, those traitors. If he had said it that way, the crowd would have erupted in applause and cheers, but Lincoln simply says, but one of them. I think Lincoln is self-consciously wanting to diminish the emotion of the crowd, that they can hear his speech and act in a way different than what they expect. In this second paragraph, I want to call your attention to something that is missing. Lincoln misses the use of personal pronouns. He only uses the personal pronoun twice in this entire address. Can you imagine a modern politician not using the word I over and over again? In fact, you look at the second paragraph, in the second sentence he says, while the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, why didn't he simply say, while I delivered the inaugural address from this place? Reminds me of one of my favorite Lincoln stories. In 1864, he was entertaining a group of soldiers from Ohio in the White House, and he said to them, you know, this is the most wonderful country in which we live. Any of your children could one day become President of the United States, just like my father's child has. My father's child. Lincoln had a conflicted relationship with his father, and yet he doesn't say just like I have. He said like my father's child has, so Lincoln-like. In the second paragraph, we also get a sense of Lincoln's rhetorical artistry, the beautiful way that he uses words, a person with 1 year of education. One of his favorite literary devices.
So let's pause there for a second, or maybe a couple seconds. What were your reactions to that first commentary about Lincoln and what he said and the kind of person he was? I'll toss out an idea that he was humble. I was struck, I saw a little reaction. How many politicians today are humble, where they try to lower expectations? Is that something that would work now?
And also the idea that he wanted to kind of regulate emotions rather than inflame them. What we see currently is a trying to inflame emotions against the other party rather than, we're all in this together. Let's, just not think the worst of the other candidate.
I think it takes a very strong inner moral character to be to display the type of humility that Lincoln is displaying here. Sometimes I think, well, maybe politicians are just reacting to the attacks of the press. But there was a free press in Lincoln's day, too, and they were quite fractious. And of course, they weren't on television, but they would be at public speeches and public events. And yet Lincoln had inner fortitude, which now seems so extraordinary, to maintain his own equilibrium and a sense of humility.
I think it's partly that he's a humble man, but it's also, I think, that he's about to win the war, but it feels like a defeat. I mean, the devastation is enormous, the problems are overwhelming, he's not sure what to do. You know, how refreshing would it be if a modern politician would say, I don't know, once. Basically, that's sort of what he's saying.
Can't predict the future.
Yeah.
Well, at some point he said that. I'm not quite sure how this country is going to turn out. And so I think that the speech was aimed to say, let's not get our expectations out of bound here, and let's not expect that much from me. It's going to be us and all. And so he's laying the groundwork.
Lincoln's humility stems right back to the Bible. His leadership style, led by God. His first Bible was given to him by his best friend's mother in 1830. And given that he had access to no formal books to read, this was the one book. And as we say, if you're cast on a desert island by yourself, what is the one book you would want to have with you? So Lincoln, everything stands out in the Bible.
And also in this passage, he talks about being inclusive. Unite the nation after war, ascribing the best possible motive to the peoples of the South.
I think that we have no way of even feeling the horrors that he had gone through, because he often visited the soldiers after battles and saw the horrors. And as you know, in today's society, we couldn't even guess what those people, north and south, and you know, the loss of family, brothers against brothers, and the fighting that was so brutal. All you got to go to Antietam and see a little cornfield where thousands died in hours. So the whole country was feeling that as well as the president.
Well, the next section deals with war, so see how he addresses that. And Paul, you get the latest.
This is what we call alliteration, use of a consonant over and over and over again, a similar consonant. Let's listen to Lincoln. All thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it. All sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects. Both parties deprecated war 8 times. In these brief sentences, Lincoln uses the consonant D. What does alliteration do for you and me, the listener? Well, what it does is it begins to bring together these thoughts. Like in music, it's often a crescendo that raises the intensity as we move through the paragraph. Lincoln understood that the use of alliteration works upon the ear in a kind of invisible rhythm that ties all of his ideas together. Now, when Lincoln spoke briefly, as at Gettysburg, 272 words, one of his favorite devices was to take the same idea, the same word, and repeat it over and over and over again for emphasis. Look at this second paragraph. Can you find the word, it's a noun, that he will say over and over and over again? It's the word war, which he says 7 times as a noun, twice as a pronoun. Well, war is what people have been talking about. This is the subject of everyone's conversation. This is what they expect to hear from Abraham Lincoln. And if we step back for a moment It's as if in the second paragraph he's become a historian or a chronicler. He begins to describe the course of this war. The war is the direct object, both dramatically and historically, of the actions of the soldiers, of the generals, and of he as commander-in-chief, until we get to the last sentence. And in this remarkable last sentence, Lincoln, as it were, reverses everything that he has set up to this moment. And the war came. You see, I think Lincoln had discovered a great truth that we are still struggling to discover. The North began this war and expected to win within 3 or 4 months. They had far more men in arms. They had a much greater industrial base. They had a much larger population to call upon. But the war went on and on and on and on, and now it had been going on for 4 years. Lincoln discovered this truth, that we start a war believing we are in control, but actually, in the end, the war is in control of us. The war had leaked out of the hands of the generals. And as Lincoln literally every afternoon visited Union and even Confederate prisoners in the hospitals of Washington, he saw the cost of this war. So in the last sentence, suddenly the war is no longer the direct object, it is the subject. And the war came. Now, we have photographs of Lincoln delivering the Second Inaugural Address, but we have no audio. I've wondered, and I want you to wonder with me, how did Lincoln say those last words? Edward Everett, who spoke at Gettysburg for 2 hours and 7 minutes before Lincoln, how would you like to follow someone like that, was the great orator of the 19th century. I can imagine that he might have said something like, "And the war came." But I don't think Lincoln spoke those words like that at all. May I suggest that for me, I think he might have said it this way, "And the war came, sadly, mournfully, 620,000 dead." The third and longest paragraph is Lincoln's recapitulation of the purpose of the war, the beginning of the war. The question has been asked in our day, what did Lincoln really think about slavery? Did he really care about African American slaves? Was his Emancipation Proclamation only a military or political maneuver?
Just pause for a comment on war. He made the point that people start wars thinking that they're in control, but as the war continues, leaders can lose control.
He certainly did not ascribe the war to one side or the other. The European view of World War I was always so-and-so started it. Our view of the Second World War in the Pacific was always the Japanese started it. But here, the war came.
Humbling when you think the number of dead. So if you were president or advising the president, what would you say in the midst of that war or wars we have today?
I think in a way the whole speech is something that might have been said by a preacher or a theologian, because what he's pondering is, what is God doing? And not just what do I do, or the war, as you say, the war takes over and is in control, but beyond that, God is in control. So here's a Presbyterian speaking. That's what I hear.
That supports the phrase here in the second to the last paragraph, where he said midway through the paragraph, yes, if God wills that it continue. So he sees God in control of it.
I think it's important to remember that it's an internal conflict. So it's not easy to demonize one side or the other because it's an internal conflict. Like the gentleman said over there, if it's Japan, that's easy. They're outsiders. Point the finger at them. But because it's an internal conflict, it's a lot harder to demonize one side or the other. We all have to go together.
But just a comment on what Ron White said on Thursday night about Ulysses S. Grant, that one of the things that endeared him to the Southern troops was at Appomattox, he treated Lee in the South magnanimously. And he also was fairly close, and he was selected by Lincoln to lead his troops because the other generals had failed. But there was a bond between Lincoln and Grant, and it shared the point you just made, that, you know, these are mere enemies today, but they're our country's brethren tomorrow.
Well, there was another context, and that is there was another general who was successful and who didn't share such bonds. And if you want to stir somebody up in the South, just mention the name William T. Sherman. Sherman's march to the sea was the equivalent of the atomic bombs on Japan. It was intended to destroy the Southern aristocracy, burn every mansion he could find, shoot every Southern gentleman he could find. So this is all sitting on top of a vindictiveness that was played out, and we play it down today because we don't want to rile things up. But Sherman's march to the sea was a terrible thing.
And people who have reflected upon what happened if Lincoln hadn't been assassinated, how that would have affected the aftermath of the war for those two tensions.
Well, I mean, and the war came in the context of what he says later. He comes very close to saying the war was God's will in some way that we don't understand. I'm not sure that's what he meant, but he comes pretty close to saying that.
Well, let's see what Ron White has to say regarding God.
What was his feeling about this? Well, one way to begin to answer that question is to look at the third paragraph. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. That little footnote there next to part means that originally he had put half, but I don't think he wanted to credit the South as having half of the nation, so he changed his word to part. Lincoln was a great editor or reviser. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. We've had lots of conversations. You will want to talk about this. What was the cause of the war? Lincoln is saying clearly here, slavery is the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents, that's a modern word, insurgents, would rend the Union even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Lincoln came back into politics in 1854 when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. It offered the possibility that slavery now might move beyond the confines of the South into the western states, and Lincoln wanted to restrict that. It could not move west. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration of which it is already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause, slavery, of the conflict might cease with or even before the conflict itself should cease. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Now Lincoln makes what I want to suggest is a shift in the content and the tone of his address when he offers the next line. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. Well, now you know that this is another case of inclusive language. What is Lincoln suggesting? He is saying to this northern audience, remember, the people of the South read the Bible as much as the people of the North. The soldiers of the Confederacy read the Bible every bit as much as the Union soldiers. But then he continues, and each invokes his aid against the other. We've often seen in our time the semicolon drop out of our language. Lincoln uses it often, and often it means to set up a kind of opposition. If the first is an affirmation, both read the same Bible. The second is really an interrogation. Lincoln is not happy with the idea that each invokes his aid against the other. In fact, Lincoln had become tired of delegations of clergy and politicians who came to him on a regular basis to say, God is on our side, God is on our side. He knew that they were also coming to Jefferson Davis to say, God is on our side. One afternoon, he literally leapt out of his chair and said, pardon me, I would like to figure out how I could get to be on God's side. For what Lincoln is saying in this statement is, God cannot be a territorial God. God is not a tribal God. God must be the God of the entire nation. And then he says this line from memory, where it's actually a verse from the Old Testament, Genesis 3:19. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but one of those semicolons again. But let us judge not, that we be not judged. I think it's as if Lincoln thought that the first part of the sentence was pretty harsh, so suddenly he offers quite a different sentiment. Let us judge not, that we be not judged. When this speech was completed, the very next day, a reporter in one of the Washington papers said, you know, this is Lincoln's Sermon on the Mount. What he meant was that this verse, let us judge not that we be not judged, comes from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And the point is that instead of an ethic of law and retribution and judgment, we ought to be practicing a law of forgiveness and reconciliation. The prayers of both could not be answered, and that of neither has been answered fully. Then Lincoln offers this affirmation: the Almighty has his own purposes. I suggest that this is the central sentence of the entire address. Central architecturally, it comes right in the middle, but central in terms of the meaning that Lincoln wants to convey. For now, if we've listened carefully, we begin to discern that along with the soldiers and the generals and Lincoln as commander-in-chief, there's another actor at work here. For Lincoln, privately and now for the first time publicly, has been asking himself the question, where is God in the midst of this Civil War? When Lincoln says both read the same Bible and the Almighty has his own purposes, I suggest that Lincoln has made a decision to speak not simply in political terms, but in religious terms or religious language. Aha, but this raises an interesting question. For many would want to say, I didn't know that Lincoln was religious. Lincoln perhaps was the only president who never joined a congregation, and yet suddenly in this address, 701 words, he will mention God 14 times, quote the Bible 4 times, and invoke prayer 3 times. And now Lincoln will make one more shift in the inaugural address that is the most startling shift of all to his audience. And the audience is surprised when suddenly Lincoln thunders forth, woe unto the world because of offenses. For it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to the man by whom the offense cometh. Rather than self-congratulation, this is self-indictment. Lincoln is saying to the assembled audience, we, American citizens, have a great evil in the midst of our society, and this evil has been there from the beginning. But remember how I said earlier it's important what one doesn't say? What if Lincoln had said to the audience, if we shall suppose that slavery is one of those offenses? The audience would have burst into applause because they would have assumed he was pointing south of the Mason-Dixon line to the south. But when he uses the inclusive word America, he is suggesting that all of us are involved in this great evil. But listen to what he says. If we We shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Lincoln is saying to the entire nation, the great offense is slavery, and we must change. Why must we change? Because this is a moral universe. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue, until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, until every drop of blood drawn with a lash, slavery, shall be paid by another drawn with a sword, 620,000 dead. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. The words of the last paragraph speak across time with malice toward none, with
We had discussion at the start of the day regarding Lincoln's religious beliefs and God, and so this is on White's thoughts on it. So now you've had a chance to think on it. What else would you like to add?
It comes across like Isaiah all the time.
I think he was also trying to still the righteous indignation of the northern clergy, the abolitionist clergy, who were probably as much for blood and revenge as anyone else. And I think he was trying to remind them that, judgment is with the Lord and not with us. So I think there was this business of trying to calm the revenge seekers.
We're going to listen to the rest of the tape tomorrow, so there's nothing next week. So his thoughts are, all read the Bible and all invoke the Lord. And then Lincoln asked, not how can we get God on our side, but how can we get on God's side? Is that something that we think about, that our politicians think about, that our leaders think about? And how does that get manifested? How do we encourage others to do this?
Not necessarily driven to this point, but it really is quite tempting when Lincoln says in this speech, he refers back to the, what does he call them, where is it in there he says about insurgent agents or seeking. He refers to that as 4 years prior. But we all know from Matthew Brady's photograph that Booth stands very prominently on that ledge there. And the intention, current to the time that he was giving this speech, was that there was the assassination plot to kill Lincoln, Grant, Johnson, and Seward that day, I think it was. It was the intention. There were 4 to be assassinated. And Lincoln is assassinated 42 days after this speech. It's chilling. And I hate to even bring it up, but we are in an inflamed state now.
What jumps out at me with this whole presentation is that Lincoln presents as a moral character, but he's only the president. And the establishment, the structure in the country is similar today. We're voting for just for the president, but the powers are much larger than one man can change. So even if he wanted to abolish slavery, it would have been possible for him to do it based on the structure of the country, based on the foreign influences. He's only the president.
And you heard that there's a lot of anger, you know, that Northern people didn't like this speech. That, the press was not that positive. It's more positive than the Europeans and elsewhere.
There was all this overriding traditions in those days that the winner of a war extracted reparations from the loser of the war. And I think he was trying to still that. If you look at how European history worked, people had a war, and then at the end of the day, somebody's territory changed hands, reparations, gold, all this stuff after World War I. So he's trying to diminish the notion that there's going to be any reparations or anything coming out of the South to the North to pay for this.
How has this, hearing this, changed your perceptions of Lincoln, if at all?
I don't know, I might be completely off base here, but it appears to me what I've heard today that there's a possibility that Lincoln is like David. I think maybe God was the one who selected Lincoln to do this job. The way he's presenting everything, I'm not sure that Lincoln actually knew what he was doing there, but if you want to think that God had selected him for this job, for this particular purpose, the Lord was giving him the means to put all of this together. I could be off base there, but that's the thought that came to my mind.
I mean, you heard the comment that made that God was mentioned 14 times, 4 Bible quotes, and he invoked prayer 3 times in 701 words. And that's the part of some of the issues we raised about is Lincoln a religious man.
Yes, you have to wonder, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yes, you have to wonder how he became so eloquent, how he had all of these literary tools at his disposal with the kind of education he had. I know he did a lot of reading of Shakespeare and so forth, but still, it's just almost so amazing that this kind of person could accomplish what he did.
It's a gift of God.
Well, but Lincoln was a lawyer, folks. He may not have had a year of education, but he still he argued in court. He had to prepare briefs. He had all the thinking that goes with being a lawyer. So the thought that you only need a year of school to do this is he learned all the time. The other thing is, in terms of the Union, you have to remember that the Northerners wanted the South in the Union. So only 90 years before this, or 80 years, writing of the Constitution, slavery was allowed in order that we could have the Union. And I'm sure there were many Yankees who didn't really want it, but the compromise is necessary, and the 3/5 counting. So Lincoln is understanding that there was complicity from the whole country in allowing this institution to go for another 100 years.
Well, so much of the South's economy stood on it.
That's right.
Whereas the economy in the North was more industrial.
One obvious question is, how would American history be different if Lincoln had lived? Because, in fact, a lot of the bad things he was trying to avoid did, in fact, happen because he wasn't there.
Just to follow on what somebody said earlier, that about Lincoln being called by God to do this. I think oftentimes you look at the Bible, God calls people to go into really scary places they'd really rather not be. And I kind of think about what it must have been like for Lincoln during the war, and especially at this time. He knows and he's seen all the forces that were unleashed by the war, the hatred's getting worse, all these forces that are could very easily get out of control. And I think part of his reliance upon God is that's what he had to rely on. That's the one thing he had that he was kind of constant and steady. And if you looked to his own self, he might have said, "Yeah, let's feed those hatreds and but I think relying on God, and yeah, I think that comes through in his speech, that he really, he probably was, there's probably an element of fear that he carried every day of his life. What was going on, what would happen to him, what would happen to his whole country.
When you think about it, God called Moses. Moses was uncomfortable with the calling. And he said, what words can I use? How can I lead?
So things for us to ponder. Next week we will hear the rest of the commentary on the Second Inaugural, and then we'll also hear a discussion on Ron White regarding Lincoln as a person we put in context. So same kind of dialogue next week. We hope you come back, and we hope you stay and talk about Lincoln and war and God and being humble and being inclusive. These are big topics which are not antiquated. So let's close in prayer. Dear Lord, give us wisdom to understand the arc of civilization and life and the challenges that people have in the time of the Civil War and today. Give us wisdom to seek unity, to be humble, to be supportive, to understand the situation around us and act positively. Give us reliance on you, God, for direction in a time of turmoil that Abraham Lincoln faced after the Civil War and that we and our leaders face today. Be with us today, through the week, and through the years ahead. In Jesus' name, amen.